The Supreme Autarch's voice echoed across the Galactic Senate, officially declaring the total annihilation of Earth. Trillions watching on live feeds held their breath, but the human ambassador didn't flinch. He simply checked his watch, adjusted his cuffs, and asked, "Will this be happening now or after lunch?" Silence fell over the obsidian amphitheater. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind that usually preceded the execution of a world. High above the diplomatic floor, standing at a podium carved from the skull of a conquered Leviathan, Supreme Autarch Vraxos glared down at the gathered species. He was a terrifying figure, clad in ceremonial armor that hummed with kinetic energy, his 4 ocular implants glowing with a dull, menacing crimson. For 3 standard centuries, the Corvalic hegemony had been the undisputed apex predator of the Orion Spur. They did not negotiate, they dictated. And today, they were dictating the end of humanity. "Your expansion is a plague," Vraxos' voice boomed, amplified by the acoustic dampeners until it rattled the ribs of every being in the chamber. "Your blatant disregard for the Treaty of Oakhaven, your illegal colonization of the borderward systems, and your sheer, unmitigated arrogance have forced our hand. The hegemony does not tolerate insolence. Therefore, by the power vested in the High Council, a state of total war is hereby declared against the Terran Alliance. Your fleets will be dismantled, your colonies will be burned, your homeworld will be reduced to a mining concession." Vraxos paused, leaning forward over the podium. He lived for this moment. The moment the color drained from the faces of lesser species. The moment the begging began. He waited for the human delegation to collapse into hysterics, to drop to their knees and plead for a servitude treaty. At the center of the pit, seated at a remarkably plain Durasteel desk, was Ambassador Richard Sterling. Richard was 62 years old, a former logistics officer turned career diplomat. He possessed the unremarkable, slightly weary appearance of a man who had spent too many decades sitting in poorly ventilated boardrooms, reading trade tariffs. His gray suit was impeccably tailored, but his demeanor was entirely devoid of the theatricality favored by the galactic stage. Beside him sat Catherine Miller, his chief of staff, her fingers resting lightly on a datapad. Behind them stood General David Hackett, a stoic pillar of a man whose expression could have been carved from granite. Richard did not fall to his knees. He did not gasp. He didn't even look particularly alarmed. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket, retrieved a pair of reading glasses, and deliberately placed them on his face. He picked up a physical pen, an archaic eccentricity that had always baffled the alien delegates, and made a small note on a paper ledger in front of him. Then, he tapped his silver wristwatch. "I apologize, Autarch Vraxos," Richard spoke, his voice carrying the calm, measured cadence of a mid-level manager noticing a discrepancy in an expense report. The translation matrix struggled for a microsecond to convey his utter lack of inflection. "I want to make sure I have this logged correctly for the stenographer back in Geneva. You are declaring a war of total annihilation. Is that correct?" Vraxos' mandibles twitched in irritation. "It is not a negotiation, Terran. It is a sentence. Your doom is sealed as of this exact microcycle." Right. Understood," Richard said, nodding slowly. He took off his glasses and looked up at the towering warlord. "My only question is regarding the timeline. It is currently 12:40 Earth Standard Time. Our delegation has a reservation at the Diplomatic Dining Concourse in 20 minutes. So, regarding this annihilation, will this be happening right now or after lunch?" A collective gasp swept through the amphitheater. The representative from the Avian Krill Collective fainted, dropping from his perch with a soft thud. Even the heavily armored Corvalic Royal Guards, trained to remain entirely motionless, subtly shifted their grips on their plasma halberds in sheer bewilderment. Vraxos stared. For a moment, the hegemony's translation software flashed an error, assuming the Terran had used an idiom that failed to convert. But the literal translation remained stubbornly intact. He was asking about a meal. "Are you malfunctioning, Ambassador?" Vraxos growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating octave. "My armada is currently warming up their slip space drives. 3,000 dreadnoughts are pointing their primary weapons at your core worlds. And you speak of sustenance?" "Well, yes," Richard replied mildly, leaning back in his chair. "A war of annihilation sounds like a rather prolonged affair. I find I make poor strategic decisions on an empty stomach. Furthermore, Article 14, Section 8 of the Intergalactic Diplomatic Charter, which you drafted, I might add, clearly states that any formal declaration of hostility must be followed by a 2-hour recess to allow diplomats to contact their respective commands before host-taking protocols are initiated. Unless, of course, the hegemony intends to violate its own sacred laws in front of the entire assembly. Richard gestured vaguely to the thousands of cameras broadcasting the proceedings to 1 trillion sentient beings across the galaxy. Vraxos felt the eyes of the galaxy upon him. To attack now, in violation of the sacred traditions of the Citadel, would make him look like a savage, lawless butcher rather than a righteous conqueror. The humans were cornered rats, trying to buy an extra hour of life. Let them have it. It would only make their despair sweeter. You have your 2 hours, Terran, Vraxos spat, the acoustic amplifiers whining with feedback. Eat your final meal. Say your farewells to your families. When the grand clock strikes the 14th hour, the Obsidian Hall will be sealed. You will be taken as prisoners of war, and the burning of Earth will commence. Excellent. Thank you, Autarch, Richard said cheerfully. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and picked up his briefcase. He turned to his delegation. Come along, Catherine, David. I hear the dining concourse is doing a passable imitation of a Niçoise salad today. Without looking back at the supreme ruler of the galaxy, the human ambassador walked out of the hall, his polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the obsidian floor. The doors of the human delegation's secure suite hissed shut, instantly engaging 3 inches of lead lining and a localized quantum jamming field. The moment the lock clicked, the facade evaporated. Richard dropped his briefcase, the cheerful demeanor vanishing like smoke. His shoulders tensed, and his eyes sharpened into chips of flint. "Sweep the room," he barked. General Hackett was already in motion, pulling a palm-sized scanner from his uniform and walking the perimeter of the room. Catherine Miller threw herself into the high-backed chair at the central console, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. "Comm lines are severed," Catherine reported, her voice tight but strictly professional. The Corvallis jammed all outbound slipspace transmissions the moment Vraxos took the podium. We are entirely cut off from Earth. The Citadel network is running a closed loop. Bug sweep is negative, Hackett confirmed, holstering the device. He turned to Richard, his jaw set. You cut that incredibly close, Richard. Vraxos looked about 3 seconds away from vaporizing us on the floor. Vraxos is a narcissist, Richard replied, moving to a small wet bar in the corner and pouring himself a glass of lukewarm water. Narcissists care about their audience. He couldn't kill us without looking like he was breaking the rules on live television. We needed this 2-hour window. Croft, talk to me. From the shadows of the suite's adjoining communications closet stepped Simon Croft. He was humanity's lead intelligence operative on the Citadel, a man who technically didn't exist on any official roster. He looked pale, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes from 3 days of chemical stimulants. The intelligence was accurate, Ambassador, Simon said, sliding a data chip across the table. I managed to slice into the Citadel's traffic control network right before the lockdown. The Corvallis 1st, 3rd, and 7th fleets aren't at their border stations. They mobilized 48 hours ago. Target? Hackett asked, leaning over the table. They aren't heading for Earth, Simon said, tapping the console. A holographic star chart materialized, glowing softly in the dim room. They bypassed the Sol system entirely. They're converging on the Proxima shipyards, our primary manufacturing hub. Vraxos doesn't want to just bomb Earth. He wants to cripple our ability to rebuild. If Proxima falls, we lose 70% of our defensive fleet capacity. Catherine looked up, her face pale. If they mobilized 48 hours ago, and they've jammed our comms, Earth Command doesn't know. The hegemony is going to drop out of slipspace right on top of Proxima in less than an hour, and our defenses won't be ready. They won't be ready because they aren't there, Hackett corrected grimly. Earth Command moved the home fleet to defend the Mars colony based on the false intelligence the hegemony fed us last week. Proxima is sitting completely exposed. Vraxos played us. A heavy silence filled the secure suite. The reality of the situation crashed down upon them. It wasn't just a declaration of war, it was an execution that was already in progress. In an hour, the human race would be effectively castrated, their shipyards burning, their fleets out of position, and their diplomatic leadership taken hostage. Richard stared at the holographic map. His expression was unreadable. He slowly drank his water, set the glass down, and let out a long, slow breath. "No," Richard said quietly. "Vraxos thinks he played us." He looked at Catherine. "Catherine, run the decryption key on the Blackwood file." Catherine blinked in surprise. "Sir? The Blackwood Protocol? But that requires a direct order from the Global Defense Council. We don't have authorization." "I am the highest-ranking representative of the Terran Alliance currently in a combat zone, which makes me the acting theater commander," Richard stated, his voice carrying an iron authority that brooked no argument. "Run the decryption, Catherine." Swallowing hard, Catherine inputted a heavily encrypted sequence of codes into the terminal. The screen flashed red, requiring a retinal scan, a vocal print, and a biometric key from both Richard and Hackett. When the process was complete, a single, unassuming file opened on the screen. Simon leaned forward, his eyes widening as he read the data scrolling across the display. "Good God," he whispered. "For the last 6 months," Richard began, pacing slowly around the table, Earth Command recognized that war with the hegemony was inevitable. Vraxos has been expanding too aggressively, but we cannot beat them in a straight fight. They have us outnumbered 10-1. So, we had to ensure that when the war started, they fought us exactly where we wanted them to. Hackett looked at the ambassador, a slow realization dawning on his face. The false intelligence about the Mars colony attack. We didn't just fall for it. We let them think we fell for it. Exactly, Richard nodded. We made a great show of moving the home fleet to Mars. Huge sensor signatures, massive logistics trains. We wanted Vraxos to believe Proxima was entirely unguarded. We wanted him to send his 3 best fleets there to strike the killing blow. "But Proxima is unguarded," Catherine argued, pointing at the map. "There are only 3 orbital defense platforms and a handful of frigates in that sector." "On the surface, yes." Richard smiled thinly. "But beneath the gas giant's cloud cover, tethered directly to the planet's magnetic field to hide their energy signatures, sits the entire Terran First Fleet, including the newly commissioned Archangel-class dreadnoughts." The room went dead silent. "We didn't just build ships," Richard continued softly. "We built an anvil. And Vraxos just swung his hammer directly onto it. The Korvalik fleets are going to drop out of slipspace expecting to butcher civilians and bomb empty shipyards. Instead, they are going to drop right into a localized gravity snare, surrounded by 3,000 human warships equipped with armor-piercing kinetic drivers." Simon let out a breath that was half laugh, half shock. "It's a slaughter. It's an ambush on a galactic scale." "But the timing," Hackett interjected, his military mind racing. "How did Command know exactly when Vraxos would strike?" "They didn't," Richard said, pulling his chair out and finally sitting down. He checked his watch again. "I did. Vraxos is obsessed with theatrics. He wouldn't launch a sneak attack without bragging about it in front of the Senate first." By analyzing his behavioral profile, our psychologist predicted he would declare war precisely when his fleets were 1 hour away from their target, maximizing the shock value while preventing us from warning anyone. Richard folded his hands on the desk. "Right now, the Korvalik Armada is 30 minutes away from entering the Proxima system. When they drop out of hyperspace, Earth Command will unleash hell. But," he paused, looking at his 3 colleagues, "if Vraxos finds out we knew about the trap before the fleet arrives, he can send an abort signal. He can order his ships to divert. That is why the Citadel comms are jammed. Not just to keep us from warning Earth, but to keep Vraxos from receiving any warnings from his own scouts." "That's why you asked for lunch," Catherine realized, staring at him in awe. "You weren't just insulting him, you were pinning him to the clock. You forced him to pause the proceedings for 2 hours. During this 2-hour recess, Vraxos is sitting in his throne room, gloating. He isn't checking his military feeds. He isn't monitoring the slipspace lanes. He thinks the game is paused." "Exactly," Richard said, a cold, ruthless light in his eyes. "We don't need to fight our way out of here. We just need to wait. In 45 minutes, the pride of the Korvalik Empire is going to be turned into drifting slag. And 10 minutes after that, we are going to walk back into that Senate chamber." He reached out and picked up a silver fork from the room service tray that had been pre-delivered to the suite. He inspected it casually. "Now," Ambassador Sterling said softly, "who's hungry?" Time became a physical weight inside the secured suite, pressing down on the chests of the four humans. The analog clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. General David Hackett stood by the reinforced door, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the locking mechanism. Catherine Miller pushed a plate of half-eaten Niçoise salad away. Her appetite entirely vanished. Only Ambassador Richard Sterling seemed unbothered, meticulously dabbing his lips with a linen napkin before taking a sip of his coffee. 40 minutes, Simon Croft announced from the communications console, his voice a tight whisper. The holographic star chart hovering above the desk had shifted from a static display to a live, pulsing feed. He had managed to bypass the Citadel's firewall, tapping directly into the deep space telemetry buoys arrayed around the Proxima system. Are the sensor buoys fully masked? Hackett asked, not looking away from the door. Encrypted and ghosted, Simon confirmed. The Corvallis sensors will read them as background cosmic radiation, but we're getting a clear picture of the gas giant. The Terran First Fleet is holding position beneath the hydrogen clouds. Richard stood and walked over to the projection. The massive blue orb of Proxima's primary gas giant dominated the display. Beneath the swirling atmospheric bands, thousands of tiny green icons sat in absolute silence. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. The fleet was running on auxiliary battery power, utilizing the gas giant's immense magnetic field to shield their reactor emissions. "Who has tactical command on the ground?" Richard asked. "Admiral Jonathan Walker," Catherine read from the decrypted dossier. "He's commanding from the bridge of the Trafalgar, one of the new dreadnoughts." She paused, her eyes scanning the technical readouts. "Sir, the sheer volume of ordnance they've stockpiled, they aren't just using standard railguns. The logistics logs show massive shipments of tungsten penetrators and the new Northrop Grumman localized gravity tethers." Richard permitted himself a grim, fleeting smile. The integration of legacy defense contractors into the intergalactic age had been a crucial step for humanity. While alien species relied on elegant, energy-intensive plasma arrays, human engineering still trusted the brute force reliability of mass acceleration. A Raytheon-designed targeting matrix could track a target moving at near light speed and calculate the exact trajectory for a solid slab of depleted uranium to intercept it. "Vraxos commands fleets that fight like duelists," Hackett murmured, stepping up beside Richard. "They trade shields, they maneuver, they wait for an opening. Walker is going to hit them with a sledgehammer in a dark alley." Suddenly, the ambient lighting in the suite flickered. A heavy metallic thud resonated against the outer airlock. Catherine jumped in her seat. Simon instinctively reached for the pistol holstered beneath his jacket. "Ambassador Sterling." A digitally synthesized, guttural voice crackled through the suite's intercom. "This is Subcommander Kale of the Obsidian Guard. The Autarch grows weary of waiting. The 2-hour recess is a courtesy, not an absolute. Unseal this door immediately. The Senate reconvenes now." Richard checked his watch. 1 hour and 45 minutes. He's early. The attack on Proxima is happening right now. He wants us on the floor before the battle concludes. "If we don't open the door, they'll burn through it," Hackett warned, drawing his own sidearm. "It'll take them 10 minutes to cut through the lead lining, but they will do it." Richard leaned toward the intercom panel. He did not press the button right away. He took a deep breath, composed his features into a mask of mild irritation, and activated the comms. Subcommander Richard projected his voice with the practiced annoyance of a man being disturbed at a country club. "I am currently finishing a rather delicate cup of Earl Grey. Furthermore, my legal counsel informs me that interrupting a sanctioned diplomatic recess under the Treaty of Oakhaven constitutes a Class Alpha violation of the Citadel Accord. Does the Autarch wish to be formally sanctioned by the Arbitration Committee before he has even fired a shot?" Silence hummed over the intercom. Richard knew he was bluffing with an empty hand. The Arbitration Committee wouldn't dare sanction Vraxos. But the Corvallis military hierarchy was notoriously rigid, obsessed with protocols and the appearance of legality. "You have 15 standard minutes," Terran Subcommander Kale finally spat back. "When the cycle concludes, we will breach the door and drag you to the podium by your hair." The intercom clicked off. "Simon." Richard turned sharply. "Status." Simon's hands flew across the holographic terminal. Slip space rupture detected in the Proxima sector. Massive energy spikes. It's them. The Korvalik 1st, 3rd, and 7th fleets are dropping into real space. The hologram shifted, zooming in on the space above the gas giant. A tear in the fabric of space-time flared with blinding violet light. Out of the rupture poured the Korvalik armada. 3,000 warships, sleek and black, their hulls bristling with plasma batteries. They moved in perfect, arrogant formation, driving straight toward the seemingly defenseless planetary shipyards. They're not deploying scouts, Hackett observed, his military discipline barely containing his awe. They're dropping right into low orbit. They think it's a milk run. Wait for it, Richard whispered, his eyes locked on the display. On the hologram, the Korvalik Vanguard crossed the invisible threshold of Proxima's inner gravity well. Gravity tethers activating, Simon reported, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Suddenly, the space around the alien armada violently warped. The Northrop Grumman gravity snares tethered to the dense core of the gas giant snapped shut. It was like a steel cable catching the leg of a running horse. The lead Korvalik dreadnoughts were violently ripped from their vectors. Inertial dampeners failed under the sudden, impossible strain. Several lighter cruisers simply snapped in half, their superstructures buckling under the artificial gravity shear. Panic rippled through the alien formation. They broke ranks, trying to pull away from the invisible riptide, their engines burning white-hot. "They're disorganized," Hackett said, gripping the edge of the table. "Their shields are fluctuating from the gravity shear. Hit them now, Walker. Hit them now." As if hearing the general across light years of space, the swirling clouds of the gas giant parted. Thousands of green icons surged upward from the atmosphere. The Terran First Fleet didn't bother with elegant maneuvers or warning shots. The moment they cleared the cloud cover, 3,000 railguns fired in unison. The sensor feed couldn't process the visual of the kinetic slugs, but it registered the impacts. Solid tungsten penetrators moving at a fraction of light speed slammed into the unshielded bellies of the Korvalik warships. Plasma armor, designed to dissipate thermal energy, shattered like glass under sheer kinetic force. Direct hits across the board, Catherine gasped, reading the telemetry. The Korvalik flagship, the Blood of Raxos, its main reactor just detonated. It's gone. The flagship is gone. For the next 10 minutes, the four humans stood in total silence, watching the annihilation of the greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen. The ambush was perfectly executed. The alien fleet, trapped in the gravity well, tightly packed and unable to maneuver, was systematically dismantled by the relentless barrage of human artillery. It was a slaughter. By the time the analog clock on the wall clicked to the final minute of their 2-hour recess, the space above Proxima was a graveyard of twisted, burning metal. The pride of the hegemony had been reduced to an expanding cloud of debris. Simon slumped back in his chair, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They're gone. 3 fleets. 200,000 Korvalich soldiers. Erased." Richard straightened his tie and adjusted his cuffs. He picked up his briefcase, the metallic click, loud in the quiet room. The mild, bureaucratic demeanor settled back over his features like a well-worn coat. "Pack up your equipment," Richard instructed calmly. "The Autarch is waiting, and it is incredibly rude to be late for one's own execution." The heavy lead-lined doors hissed open precisely at the 2-hour mark. Sub-Commander Kale stood waiting, a squad of heavily armed Korvalik Royal Guards flanking him. Their plasma halberds hummed with lethal intent. Kale glared down at the human delegation, his mandibles clicking in anticipation of the violence to come. "The recess is over, Terrans," Kale growled. "Move." Richard strolled out of the suite, entirely unhurried. He offered a polite nod to the towering alien guard. "Lead the way, Sub-Commander. I find a brisk walk aids digestion." They were escorted back through the sprawling, vaulted corridors of the Citadel. Along the way, delegates from dozens of other species watched them pass. Some looked away in shame, others watched with morbid curiosity, viewing the humans as dead men walking. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of impending tragedy. The massive double doors of the obsidian amphitheater groaned open. The roar of the galactic senate washed over them. High upon his podium, Supreme Autarch Vraxos stood with his arms raised, basking in the adoration and fear of the assembly. The moment the human delegation stepped onto the floor, the acoustic dampeners silenced the crowd. A single spotlight snapped down, illuminating Richard Sterling and his team. "Ah," Vraxos's voice boomed, dripping with sadistic pleasure. The Terran ambassador returns. I trust your final meal was satisfactory? It was quite good, thank you, Richard replied, stepping up to his Durasteel desk. He opened his briefcase and casually pulled out a small, rectangular data drive. The vinaigrette was a bit heavy on the mustard, but one can't expect culinary perfection in a government building. Vraxos let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed like thunder. Your false bravado is pathetic, human. The clock has struck. The hour of your doom is at hand. Even as we speak, the might of the Corvallic hegemony is descending upon your worlds. Your skies are burning. Your people are screaming. Vraxos leaned over the podium, his four crimson eyes locking onto Richard. I offer you one final fleeting mercy. Kneel before this assembly. Swear eternal servitude to the hegemony, and I will order my fleets to spare a fraction of your population to serve in our labor camps. Defy me, and you will join the ashes of your homeworld. The entire Senate held its breath. Trillions of viewers across the galaxy leaned closer to their screens. Richard didn't kneel. He didn't even look up at the autarch. Instead, he plugged the rectangular data drive into the Senate's primary projection terminal on his desk. Autarch Vraxos, Richard said, his voice calm, steady, and amplified across the Great Hall. Before we discuss treaties, I have a procedural question regarding your communications blackout. Have you checked your secure military channels recently? Vraxos scowled. Do not attempt to stall, Terran. The Citadel network is locked by my command. No distress signals will reach you. That wasn't my question, Richard corrected mildly. I wasn't asking if I had received any messages. I was asking if you had. With a flick of his wrist, Richard bypassed the Senate's visual feed and routed his data drive directly into the massive holographic projector that hung suspended in the center of the amphitheater. The image of Vraxos vanished. In its place, a colossal, high-definition recording flared to life. It was the telemetry feed from Proxima. The Senate gasped as the image of the Corvallic Armada dropping out of slip space appeared above them. They watched, confused at first, as the magnificent black dreadnoughts suddenly lurched and buckled under the invisible weight of the gravity snares. What trickery is this? Vraxos roared, his hands slamming down on his podium. Turn off that projector! This is not a trick, Autarch, Richard spoke over the rising murmurs of the crowd. This is a live delay feed from the Proxima system, recorded exactly 45 minutes ago. On the projection, the clouds of the gas giant parted. The Terran First Fleet rose like avenging angels. The Senate erupted in a cacophony of shrieks and shouts as the human railguns fired. They watched in absolute horror as the invincible Corvallic fleet, the bedrock of the hegemony's power, was shredded into scrap metal in real time. The detonation of the blood of Vraxos lit up the amphitheater with a blinding, spectral light. High on his podium, Vraxos froze. The color drained from his armored face. His jaw slackened. That is impossible, Vraxos stammered, his booming voice suddenly sounding very small and hollow. My fleets, they were striking an unguarded shipyard. You struck an anvil, Vraxos, Richard said, his tone dropping its mild facade, turning cold and razor-sharp. You moved your pieces exactly where we wanted them. You fell for a feint designed by human tacticians, executed with human engineering, and powered by your own blinding arrogance. Richard tapped his keyboard. The holographic projection shifted from the battlefield to a rolling spreadsheet. 3,000 warships destroyed, Richard read aloud, his voice echoing like a judge reading a sentence. 200,000 casualties. The entirety of your 1st, 3rd, and 7th fleets neutralized. The Corvallic hegemony has just lost 70% of its offensive military capability in less than an hour. Chaos consumed the obsidian amphitheater. Delegates were screaming, pointing at the human delegation, pointing at the shattered autarch. The myth of Corvallic invincibility had been publicly, brutally executed on live television. Lies! Vraxos shrieked, spittle flying from his mandibles. He frantically pounded the communications console on his podium. Lift the jamming field! Connect me to Fleet Command! Connect me now! The quantum jamming field dropped. Instantly, the Citadel's main audio system shrieked as thousands of backlog automated distress signals from the Proxima system flooded the network. The automated, desperate voices of dying Corvallic ship minds echoed through the hall, begging for reinforcements that would never come. The proof was undeniable. Vraxos slowly collapsed back into his grand throne, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. The supreme predator had suddenly realized he had walked into a slaughterhouse. Down on the floor, Richard Sterling calmly closed his briefcase. He looked up at the ruined autarch. Now, the human ambassador said, his voice cutting through the wailing of the alien delegates with chilling clarity, I believe we have a war to negotiate. Pandemonium reigned in the obsidian amphitheater. The acoustic dampeners had completely overloaded, screeching with electronic feedback as thousands of alien delegates screamed, panicked, and transmitted the raw footage back to their respective homeworld. The invulnerable Korvalek hegemony had just been decapitated on live broadcast. Up on his grand podium, Supreme Autarch Vraxos was trembling. The massive, terrifying warlord looked suddenly ancient, his crimson ocular implants dimming as the reality of the disaster severed his neural combat stims. Guards! Vraxos suddenly shrieked, his voice cracking with desperate, wild fury. He pointed a trembling, armored claw down at the human delegation. Treason! Sabotage! Kill them! Execute the Terrans immediately. Sub-Commander Kale and the 24 royal guards stationed around the pit lowered their plasma halberds. The humming blades leveled directly at Richard Sterling's chest. Catherine Miller flinched, but General David Hackett immediately stepped in front of her, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm. Richard did not move. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting on his Durasteel desk, staring up at the autarch with eyes as cold as deep space. I would strongly advise against that, Sub-Commander, Richard said. His voice was not raised. Before you follow the orders of a dead man, you should ask yourself if you wish to share his grave. Kale hesitated. The imposing alien warrior looked from the furious, sweating autarch to the infuriatingly calm human diplomat. The myth of Korvalik's supremacy had just been shattered. Kale's absolute faith in his leader was unraveling by the second. What are you waiting for? Vraxos roared, slamming his fists against the console. Strike them down! Our core fleets are gone, but we still have the homeworld defenses. We will mobilize the planetary reserves. We will crush their wretched Earth. Richard let out a slow, disappointed sigh. He reached into his briefcase one final time, pulling out a sleek, black data pad. Autarch, your inability to grasp multi-theater strategy is precisely why your empire is ending today, Richard said, tapping the screen. Did you really think the Terran First Fleet at Proxima was our only operational asset? You spent so much time tracking our military buildup, but you failed to monitor our corporate sector. Richard tossed the datapad onto the desk, projecting a new holographic image into the center of the room. It was not a recording this time. It was a live, encrypted transmission. The image resolved to show a massive, rust-red planet hanging in the void of space. It was Korval Prime, the crown jewel of the hegemony, the impenetrable fortress world. But it was no longer impenetrable. While you were busy staring at the Proxima system, Richard continued, his voice echoing through the silent, terrified Senate, Earth Command partnered with Lockheed Martin and Boeing's experimental propulsion divisions. The fleet you thought we sent to Mars wasn't a feint to draw you out. It was a staging ground for the new Alcubierre drive carriers. The hologram zoomed in. Orbiting directly above the Korvalik capital city, hovering ominously beyond the reach of the planetary defense cannons, was a fleet of 500 massive human warships. At the center of the formation was a supercarrier, its hull proudly bearing the name USS Oppenheimer. Admiral Thomas Montgomery of the Terran Second Fleet sends his regards, Richard stated, smoothing his tie. They dropped out of fold space 10 minutes ago. They have already locked onto your primary power grids, your orbital defense matrix, and the High Council's residential palace. The localized quantum payload they carry is capable of cracking your planet's mantle. Vraxos staggered backward, his knees buckling under the weight of his ceremonial armor. He collapsed onto his throne, the fight completely draining out of him. He was outmaneuvered, outgunned, and entirely defeated. You wouldn't, Vraxos whispered, the translation matrix barely picking up the sound. The Treaty of Oakhaven, the Citadel Accords. Orbital bombardment of a capital world is a war crime. The Treaty of Oakhaven, Richard countered sharply, which you publicly voided exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes ago when you declared a war of total annihilation against my species. Richard picked up his physical pen and tapped it against his paper ledger. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. However, humanity is not in the business of genocide, Richard said softly. We prefer stable markets and secure borders. We will not fire on Corval Prime, provided you accept our terms. Terms? Vrexos rasped, his pride utterly broken. Unconditional surrender of all Corvalic forces, Richard dictated, reading from his ledger. The immediate dissolution of the hegemony's imperial mandate, the liberation of all subjugated worlds within your borders, and, most importantly, the transfer of your orbital shipyards to the Terran Alliance as reparations. The Senate chamber was dead silent. The undisputed masters of the galaxy were being stripped of everything they owned by a man in a gray suit. And if I refuse, Vraxos asked bitterly, then Admiral Montgomery will test the Oppenheimer's main weapon on your palace, and I will negotiate these exact same terms with whoever is left alive to dig through the rubble, Richard replied without a shred of hesitation. The choice is yours, Autarch, but I strongly suggest you hurry. Richard checked his silver wristwatch, a gesture that now struck absolute terror into the hearts of every alien present. It is currently 3:15 Earth Standard Time, the ambassador said smoothly, and I have a tea time at the Geneva Diplomatic Golf Course in 4 days that I absolutely refuse to miss. Sign the treaty, Vraxos. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Supreme Autarch Vraxos slowly reached for his terminal. With a trembling hand, he inputted his biometric signature, broadcasting the unconditional surrender of the Corvalic hegemony across the galaxy. Sub-Commander Kyle quietly powered down his plasma halberd and took a step back, bowing his head in submission to the humans. The age of the hegemony was over. The era of humanity had begun. Richard Sterling nodded approvingly. He closed his ledger, capped his pen, and snapped his briefcase shut. Excellent, Richard said, turning to his stunned chief of staff. Come along, Catherine. Let's go home. I think we've had quite enough excitement for one afternoon. The human ambassador's calculated brilliance proved that true power isn't just about plasma cannons and dreadnoughts. It's about patience, strategy, and knowing exactly when to check your watch. If you loved this HFY sci-fi drama, hit that like button, share it with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe to our channel for more epic tales of humanity outsmarting the galaxy.